it's about creating a culture. It's not about a particular age group. It's about creating a culture in which all are truly welcome, but also being willing to look at what's essential and maybe what can be modified or even let go of. And so there's a lot to think about in this particular area, and we have an expert. So Jimmy, thank you.
An expert, a practitioner, maybe not an expert. Allisyn, thank you, and thanks to all of you for coming this morning. Just to, in the interest of transparency, I want to make it absolutely clear, and if you want to get up and go attend another workshop, I totally understand that there are no magic bullets here. I think we all know that. So what I'm going to talk about is my experience, also my observations about the culture, both the culture of the church and the wider psycho-spiritual and secular culture, and the implications that those observations have on the practice of ministry, and particularly the practice of ministry within the confines of our church, the Episcopal Church. I also do really want this to be conversational, because I don't think it's going to be particularly practically and logistically helpful to you if we don't have some kind of conversation about your concerns about young-ish people in your congregations. I say youngish because I've been ordained for 15 years. I'm 43 years old. Almost every single time I come into a meeting in the Episcopal Church, somebody makes the comment, "It's so nice to have a young person in the room." And I'm like, I'm now solidly middle-aged, right? I'll be lucky. I'll be beating the odds if I live to 86. And our constituency still considers me very young. And that's not a good thing. Not that there aren't younger, really talented clergy coming up. So just as sort of an overall universal observation, good news and bad news. What do you want first?
Good.
Good news. Good news is that good news is still the good news. The work and person of Jesus is still alive within the world today, functioning quite effectively. The Spirit is partnering within and without the church in really encouraging, energizing, creative ways as we would expect. The bad news is that no one is really speaking our language anymore, except for ourselves. And I think if we can use that, if we can use language as a metaphor for how we practice our faith within the context of the institution of the Episcopal Church, I think that would be helpful. Mostly I think it would be helpful because there's nothing wrong with speaking the language that we speak. It's a perfectly good language to use to communicate the things that we want to communicate with people who speak the same language. Where we do fall down is when we keep speaking at people in a language that they have no exposure to and no understanding of. I'll give you a real-time example of that. I have a young associate who works for me. His name is Scott. And because my community is pretty eccentric, we sent Scott off to Yale Divinity School. He came back, and he works with me now at FADS, but we're a non-traditional community. So, I said, Scott, you might want to just dip your toe in a traditional place, find some place where you could exercise ministry in a somewhat traditional way in the middle of the week, just so you have that experience and you have that on your resume. And that's partly because I want him to have the full experience of exercising his priesthood within the large boundaries of the church, but it's also because because Scott came out of our community and into seminary through our community, he is not as fluent in the language that you and I speak. And I wanted him to gain some more fluency so that he can be an effective evangelist for the work that we do back to the church. So Scott goes down the street. There's a traditional Episcopal church about 150 yards from our offices in Santa Monica. And on Wednesday morning, he serves a Wednesday morning Eucharist that is organized around the farmer's market in Santa Monica. And he came in this Wednesday morning, he's like, "You're never gonna believe what happened. It's so amazing, it's crazy." And I was like, "Tell me about it." And Scott and this other priest, Nate, who is the rector of the church there and also a dear friend of mine, engaged a woman after the Eucharist who was full of questions, and she had a yoga mat underneath her arms and wandered into the congregation and said, "Well, I'm enlivened by this practice and what you guys are doing. This is my second time that I've been here, and it's a relatively small. There are about 20 or 30 people that come to that Eucharist, and so you know who's a regular and who's not a regular." And at the door, she began asking Nate questions about the Episcopal Church and about the practice of ministry and about the history of the Episcopal Church. And Scott said one of the first things, she said, "Well, what's the deal with this place?" She has no context for church. In fact, her context for church is her yoga practice. That's her spiritual practice, and that practice has given rise to more spiritual hunger. And so she wandered into a church that is literally 5 door stops down from the yoga studio. She said, "I've been walking past on Sunday mornings, I see people coming in and out." So she asked Nate, the rector, what is this church like? What's the history here? And he said, "Well, we're an Episcopal church. We're organized in a geographical region called the Diocese of Los Angeles that is overseen by a bishop." Nice.
Can you close the blinds? Can you go for that? Christina's a professional. You guys are really. Hold on.
Oh, so cute.
Maybe
turn off the light?
Turn off the lights. Yeah.
Maybe open the other door.
Open the door, paddle light.
It'll go to the right. There you go.
That's what you need to know. Sorry.
I'm used to it. I originally grew up in Texas, and I immigrated to California about 12 years ago, and I've really found myself at home here. But one of the things that I love about this is, like, where I grew up, people wouldn't go like, "Oh." That's when hummingbirds. So I'm at home here. In any event, Nate said, "We're a geographical boundary. We're organized under the leadership of a bishop." She's like, "What's a bishop?" Good question, right? Chess piece, right? And he said, well, how did this church come to be? And he said, "Well, do you remember the Reformation?" And she's like, "Reformation of what?" So you can see where this goes, and the only I think Scott was able to be a little bit more helpful in just dismantling some of our traditional, more religious or ecclesiological language that we all speak fluently, but the culture doesn't speak. And maybe she comes back, maybe she doesn't come back. When we talked about that in the office afterwards and sort of debriefed it. I said, just in the interest of transparency, like I go to yoga at least twice a week and I really enjoy the practice. But whenever I find myself in the studio that really brings in like more traditional religious yogic language that comes from Hindu tradition, I usually don't go back to that studio. Just because it doesn't make sense to me. It's not because I don't get it, it's just because I don't speak that language. That's not my context and where I find a footing. So if we are going to attract young, under-churched people, middle-aged, young, under-churched people, have got to let go of some of the things that we find some of the things that are described. I knew I would bore that
That was a newcomer.
Yeah, big front door, big back door, right? So let me sort of give you, and if any of you at any time has any question or any response to what I'm saying, please just raise your hand or speak out, and we'll address that as we need to address it anymore. I think we have time to work through this. Yeah.
Just a news note, I don't know if some of you might have heard that the ambassador, our ambassador to the Congo, French Congo, was quoted as giving an interview in pidgin English. And what a wonderful, it's been celebrated and it's hit the internet because he spoke to the people in pidgin English, which is their language. Right. This is the first time a white person has done that ever to them, and they think it's wonderful. So communication again, speaking in what they understand. This just hit the news this morning.
Yeah, well, that's a great example of, of being able to engage the culture, being able to engage the culture in real time. Let me just give you some sort of State of the Union inside the church and state of the church as I see it engaging the culture. And I'm just going to sort of run through some bullet points that might be helpful or might not be helpful. And again, interrupt me if you want. But well, I think we all have some sense that there's just a massive population decline in our denomination. There's, the church has been talking about it for as long as I've been a part of the church, which is about 20 or 25 years. We haven't been very responsive to that decline, which is okay. I think necessity is the mother of invention. So with each year that we fail to respond to the needs of a different generation, the stakes become higher. And I have seen that more people are willing to talk about this now. We also face what I somewhat endearingly call a Hogwarts scenario. I have an 8-year-old daughter, and for the first time, we have been reading together the Harry Potter series, and we're about 2/3 of the way through Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, the first book, and I'm like, oh my God, like this is so much a part of our experience. I only mention that because I don't think we have a sense of how weird we look to the rest of the culture. It's normal for us to come into a room where somebody's wearing a uniform that a priest wears, or in an exaggerated scenario, someone comes to church and someone's vested. Those clothes are really old clothes. And I'm not speaking in favor or against vestments, but what I'm saying is we need to have an awareness of how incredibly eccentric we are viewed by the greater population. I went to the Diocese of Tennessee. Every year, the 3 dioceses of Tennessee have a big men's conference. And all the men from the 3 dioceses of Tennessee go off to Swanee and have a conference, and it's about 500 men, and I went and spoke. And I was sitting in the chapel at Swanee, and there was a guy, and he was fresh back from Iraq, sort of stumbled into an Episcopal church and found some community there that was giving him some nurture and support around his post-trauma stress and his family challenges and reintegrating back into the community following his deployment. But he's still trying to work his Episcopal affiliation out. And we were sitting in the pew, and we kind of connected over the weekend, and he was like, man, I still just don't get the whole, like, funny hat and staff thing and everything. And he's wearing glasses, and I was like, Dave, take your glasses off. He's like, okay. So he takes his glasses off, and he's sitting there. And we're in this, do you know the chapel at Swanee? It's like a huge, beautiful church, but it's huge. He takes his glasses off, and I was like, hey, Dave. He's like, what? He's like, I was like, can you tell which one the bishop is without your glasses on? He's like, yeah, I can make him out. He's blurry, but I can make him out. I was like, that's why. Because this whole thing with the funny hat and the staff and the big crazy clothes came up long before there was lens crafters. Yeah. So if you're sitting in a European cathedral 500 years ago, how do you know who the bishop is? If you're like me, you can see the bishop. You can't see him well. It would have been a him then. You can't see him well, but you can see him. You know who he is. So there were reasons, good reasons, that we had the sort of Hogwarts clothes that we have. Some of those reasons can stick around in some places. Some probably need to go away over time, my opinion.
The language or how weird we look, I think also applies to all of those people who are stumbling into the Episcopal Church from a non-denominational background, who seem to have done a better job at attracting 20-year-olds, and now they're 30 and 40, and they stumble into an Episcopal church and they know zero, even though they're church, they know zero about what it is we're doing, and we look wacky to them too.
Yeah, I probably ought to say something. Can I sort of address? There's this, there's an issue that happens within our denomination too that's related to that, not quite directly, but there was a lot of energy. You know, the church that I'm a part of is kind of a so-called emergent church. There was a lot of energy and excitement in kind of more ambitious Episcopal colleagues when young evangelicals began to wash out of larger evangelical communities because they were hungry for more ritual. And our constituency kind of galvanized and we're like, yes, like they're finally coming around. I don't really believe they're coming around. What I believe is that they're exercising an area of atrophy. So they know the narrative really well. You know, they grew up in these Bible-oriented churches. And they know the narrative really well. But what they're hungry for is that mystery side. It's just like if you went to the gym every day and you worked out only your chest, you would be like a weird-looking person. You know, and you would ultimately disable you. So they're just natural. They're doing what human beings do. They're naturally seeking their area of atrophy. So before we all go like, you know, finally everyone's coming around for the Episcopal Church, you should know that like the congregation that I serve is very narrative-based, not ritual-based. And Episcopalians come to it and they're like, how is this an Episcopal church? Well, you know, we're in the Diocese of Los Angeles. I'm an Episcopal priest. We're under the governance of the Episcopal Bishop of the Diocese of Los Angeles. That's what makes us an Episcopal church. So I don't want you to get too attached to the idea that all these young people are coming back to the Eucharist. They're not. There's an equal number of young people who are starving for story, for narrative. Sorry, you were going to say
Yeah, I
something.
just had a quick little anecdote. It's not specific to the Episcopal Church, but Christianity in general. My brother's a pastor in the UCC church, and as he was going through seminary, he had a conversation he's like, well, we eat the flesh and drink the blood of the person that we think is our savior. And it's like, people think that's weird too, you know?
Totally
They
weird.
don't go to church.
Yeah.
So you come in and all of a sudden you're attending the Eucharist. It could be very.
It at least begs explanation, doesn't it?
Yes.
Another point, and I'm sure some of you struggle with this idea, but we feel as though we have limited assets in our denomination. I would challenge that. I know that church budgets are in decline. I'm not unaware of that, but the Episcopal Church still governs about $22 billion worth of assets in the United States of America. $22 billion is a lot of money. A lot of money. $9 billion of those assets are tied up in one of our institutions, which is called Trinity Wall Street. So people are like, how are we going to save the Episcopal Church? I'm like, we only have to liquidate one asset. Not really. What I do want to point out, though, is that you may be sitting in here feeling as though your church doesn't have resources. You do have resources. You're just probably not willing to do something with those resources that a lot of other people would do. I consult with churches quite a bit, and a lot of that consult ends up with their financial statement from time to time. And one of the things that I say to congregations oftentimes is like, if this were a family, if we were looking at a family's budget, and this was the family's budget, what would we tell the family to do? And they're like, I don't know. I'm like, we would tell the family to sell their house and move into an apartment because that's the responsible thing to do. That's the being good stewards of our resources. If we're being good stewards of our resources, we would sell the house and move into an apartment. That's a really exceedingly hard thing to do. It's hard. It's a hard thing for families to do. It's a harder thing for churches to do, probably. But just because it's hard doesn't mean that it's not something we might need to consider. We also have this, related to that, is we have this altered economic. Yeah.
Yeah, I just had a comment. Trinity has been. I've read they've had a big argument about some of the people there want to keep the money and some want to give it away.
Yeah.
Yeah, people are leaving. They don't think they can give away any of the $9 billion or whatever you said.
Yeah, they're in a leadership transition, so it'll be interesting to see what and who they call and what kind of.
Interesting perspective on how much is enough.
Yeah, absolutely. We also in the church have this altered economic model that's not really sustainable. When we first started expanding the church westward, the idea was that about 150 people could support a 5-acre church with one religious professional. And the math just doesn't work on that anymore. So we have a challenge there. And then on the positive side of things, I would say we have like remarkably good resources in the Episcopal Church. Our ability to translate the use of those resources has atrophied, but nevertheless, they remain really strong. We have common prayer. That common prayer does require a little more explanation and a little more translation, but it's galvanizing for a culture that is increasingly disconnected. We have the Eucharist. We have a meal. Part of the issue with the Eucharist is that we've gone a little more altar and a little less table. If maybe some of you know, I don't mean to offend Anglo-Catholics either. This is probably my Protestant sensibility and also my more mission-oriented work with unchurched people. But Maybe some of you know the Harvard University study. Harvard did a study in the 90s about what's the qualifying factor for being in the top quarter of the class at Harvard, in the sense of what gets you there. The single thing that they could find for that constituency of people, the single galvanizing factor that pushed you toward the top quarter of your class at Harvard, was that those students who are in the top class, in spite of their socioeconomic class, in spite of their ethnicity, in spite of their educational background, shared 3.8 or more meals around a family table a week. Wow, right? We have accidentally and with the best of intentions reorganized our communities over the last 35 years around a table. It just doesn't quite look like a table anymore, and what we do doesn't quite look like a meal. But our intuition is good. I don't necessarily think that Jesus said, do this in remembrance of me, so that we would weekly ritualize the Eucharist. I think Jesus had a deeper sense that the table is elementary school for human relationship and spiritual practice. You know, a real idea of, you know, one of the other statistics about family meals is that married couples that are in crisis, if they institute family meal in their household, whether they have children or not, but if they institute a family meal practice of having 3 or more family meals a week, they either divorce very quickly or they reconcile. That's kind of awesome, right? I mean, you just cannot sit at a table with somebody week in and week out, day in and day out, week in and week out, month in and month out, and remain enemies. It's just not possible. So we have these. We also have alternative worship resources. We have a denomination that embraces diversity at nearly every level. So we do have these assets that might require some translation, some retranslation, probably continued retranslation, but they're nevertheless assets. Yeah.
Has anyone ever taken the prayer book and not changed the prayers per se, but made the rest of it, the bishop, collect all those kinds of language into contemporary language?
Yeah. Yes and no. That's what happens with prayer book revision. That's what you see in traditional language and contemporary language. But where we sit now is that contemporary language is now traditional language again.
Yeah.
What we also have, and what we've always had in the Episcopal Church, is the church doesn't change by legislating change. We change by allowing communities to go out and innovate contextually, and we see what works historically and how it works and if it works and if it spreads, and then like a decade later we're like, we should do this. So there are communities that are rewriting Eucharistic prayers and retranslating, and that's how we get alternative worship resources. Now, the truth of the matter is within the context of our ecclesiology, that requires permission of the bishop. So we're not, I'm not saying you have permission to go out and do that. But I am saying I do because I got that permission because it's really important in my mind to begin to engage retranslating common worship. Yeah.
So if we can't actually get the permission, what we could do is to have translations available. In other words, if we had translations available, then we could.
Yeah,
that probably doesn't violate the letter of the law. But it's certainly there are
But if
ways.
they come in and they want, the it's an idea, just, have the translation.
There are definitely communities that have done that within their context of their worship leaflets, that you open it up and there's an explanation on one side and the liturgy on the other. Yeah, I'm not really sure what that gets you truly these days, because people are looking for something a little bit more, I
But it
think.
brings them to the third time.
It might, yeah.
One of the challenges I face, I have actually a worldwide ministry, drawing people to church, whether it's a mosque, a traditional church, whatever. And I had a situation here at St. Bartz. In this ministry in San Diego, I was very anxious to have people come apart St. Bartz because I felt that it could be really good for them. And a few years ago, we had a newcomers Sunday where you were supposed to invite somebody to come to church. And I had about 40 people, highly intellectual, spiritual, and open to religion. They didn't have a problem with language, they didn't have a problem with funny hats because they're very open-minded. But I was looking for a way to bring them in. I thought, boy, this is going to be just great. I'll bring, invite all 40, and maybe they'll make St. Bart's part of their life. But I actually drafted an email to all of them to entice them to come. But as it evolved, it ended up becoming really family-oriented Sunday, which is a good thing, because when you look at the demographics of Highway Ranch Bernardo, it's all families.
Yeah.
And so I ended up actually not sending out that invite, because I thought what's going to happen is they're going to come here, Bill, this is a swell church. It's not for me because it's for families and I'm single, and, and so forth. And I'm not really sure, I'm kind of struggling, with that paradox, if you will. We want to be family oriented. It isn't necessarily an economic thing, because these 40 people are very wealthy and don't hesitate to be giving money to charity and so forth. But how do we balance that? And that's a challenge I think that a lot of us face, particularly people in my type of ministry.
I think likely we would balance that at the institutional level, not necessarily at the congregational level, in the sense that you're going to find a context and a history and sort of a family system that supports families, or it supports a more mixed economy of people, and that's probably just the way that is. But to not have some sense at the larger level around the importance of strategizing around that and making sure that there are places. I mean, lots of people have cars these days and get around that way, and so, the idea of not being able to make it to this church or that church has drifted away as a problem. So I think having a strategy at the diocesan level, or maybe even in a deanery level or something, would be a good idea. Yeah.
I just wanted to make the suggestion that maybe we look at our intake model, because what we've all been talking about is getting people to come to church on Sunday. And I have, a ton of friends who are spiritually hungry but do not think in terms of the state of their soul, if they even think they have one. What they are interested in doing is coming to help in the food pantry.
Mm-hmm.
They're very interested in coming to a book club where you talk about some spiritual issues or even some religious issues. But the idea of starting by walking in the door of that church is not something they're going to think about. So maybe we need to make some adjustments to our intake model.
I absolutely agree with you, and I think, we can get down to that. I can make some sort of programmatic recommendations to you down the line, but I think, in my community, what we say is we're Monday through Saturday followers of Jesus who gather on Sunday. I mean, we've intentionally tried to flip the model around of like, come on Sunday or don't come on Sunday, but follow Jesus within the context of some relational community that can support you and help you engage in making a love-spreading difference and engaging your style of the God love life in an intentional way out in the world. I mean, I honestly, all these churches could go away tomorrow, as far as I'm concerned, as long as the work of the gospel continues to be done and the community of people who do that work have some sort of support around it.
I'll mention communication too. I know there's workshops going on about this separately, but just a couple things. There's so much information at your fingertips on the web that if you don't have your activities, whether it's Sunday or otherwise, on your website, it's going to be that much harder for people to find out about them and come to them. They're not necessarily going to come to church first. They're just going to go, like what I did, I went on the web, I'm like, what's the most physical church in my house? Grace San Marcos, great, I'm going to check it out, and it worked out, it was awesome. But that's where I found my church. And so communicating that way. And even email, I learned this through my job, the click-through rate of emails is like slim to none. So email isn't reaching people anymore because they're getting so many emails that they just don't have time to open all of them. So that's quickly becoming outdated as well. So the more you can do to get on social media and find those other ways to reach out to people where they can find you easier, will make it easier for them to join your community.
And I have to underscore that because my ministry is all on Facebook.
Yeah. So, I think that's important. I think what's important first is being real, you know, and really having something to offer. We can market the heck out of ourselves, but if it was a marketing problem, 815 would have solved that, right? We would have been like, let's spend $5 million on the most like incredible marketing campaign ever and just rebuild the church back. But that doesn't work. So I wish that it would, but it doesn't.
But you not know
815 is the National Church headquarters.
Language.
Yeah. State of the culture. What are the challenges that we face in attracting young people into any organized spiritual practice within the context of the Episcopal Church? What I find is the culture is really anti-religious, but exceedingly spiritual. So people are really hungry, and in my context, they're hungry enough, they're spiritually hungry enough to come back to tasting some religious institution. So they've been up and down the spiritual buffet. They've tried to put together their own personal privatized religion, because that's how we do it in America, which is cool. I'm not, you know, they gave it a shot, and then comes cancer or job loss or divorce or something that kind of pulls the rug out from under that spiritual, you know, that personal spirituality, that individual religion. And so they're like, I need something with some more teeth, and I'm willing to engage in something that I don't quite buy the full package in order to get this relational support piece. The culture is incredibly disconnected. You may have heard this week that NPR just did a study did a piece on a study that said millennials have less trust than any demographic generation in the history of the United States of America since we've been studying generations, which is only about maybe 65 years, to be honest. All that stuff comes out of marketing and advertising. But it's telling. I don't believe they have less trust because of world events. I believe we have less trust because of an atrophied ability to really truly relate to people. We don't have to do that anymore, and we have things like the thing in my pocket that distracts us from that. Now, the thing's not going away. The thing in my pocket is not going away. So how do we institute physical therapy or elementary school for human relationship so that people have that area of atrophy met? You know, it's around the table, most likely. We're also just fear infused, and that's just a post 9/11 reality that we have. If we're fear infused, then we have less hope. If we have less hope, there is a legitimate cultural stifling of creativity and innovation. So the sort of sociological or psycho-spiritual track that makes is fear and hope get together, and they have a baby. Her name is Courage. Courage bears two children, creativity and innovation. So if fear and hope don't get together and don't have courage, we lack creativity and innovation. That's my take on that. Yeah, good.
Arguably, doesn't some of that,
Say that again.
arguably sort of in our favor, doesn't some of that come from sort of fundamentalism and,
Sure.
and big church leaders kind of like when Hurricane Sandy hits, kind of blaming it all on, other communities and other elements within society and saying, this is all God's doing this because we accept these people.
Yeah, I think fundamentalism is a major sociological issue that we face in our culture right now. And we're sort of in the hands of postmodernism, but we're still fighting fundamentalism. We're literally fighting it in Afghanistan. We're fighting it in different ways here. We're still coming out of that mindset. It's a huge, huge cultural issue.
Could you repeat that, your
Yes.
fear, hope, courage?
Fear and scenario.
Sure. Fear and hope get together and have a baby. Her name is Courage. Courage bears two children, creativity and innovation. Does that kind of make sense? You can see that. Two more things on, yeah.
I was kind of going to add on that. I think there comes a time when the church needs to change to actually meet the needs and become attractive to the younger generation, because at least and I know everybody from the cathedral, some of you are not going to like this, but sorry, the young people don't want to come and listen to the organ forever. They're like, your church is kind of done to attract the younger generation likes the guitar. They like that kind of worship. And at one of our stewardship meetings, when we were talking about the new dean, there's basically one side of the room is the choir and everybody else, and the choir says, we don't want somebody who's happy clappy.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. But that falls just into that all-word scenario. It's lovely and it works, but it is an old way and an eccentric. The organ is a very eccentric instrument. Do we know this? Yes, it's very eccentric. One person plays it. We're like, what? We don't make music like that really anymore. Music is more collaborative these days. So yeah, I agree. I think just another thing to note is that a challenge is that 50%, studies count 50% of Harvard freshmen were medicated on some sort of SSRI, which SSRIs are good things for people who deal with legitimate profound depression. But we also should be aware that they do affect our brain function and our ability to engage things and people at a certain level. I asked, who Brene Brown is. Brene Brown's a shame researcher and a really amazing scholar and author, and she's also an Episcopalian. And I tracked her down and got to hang out with her for a few days, and I said, Brene, how do I inspire people who are on a moderate dose of SSRIs? And you know what she said? That's why I don't like working in California. It's hard. So there are these real barriers that we
Did
face.
she answer the question?
That was her response.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to get into some more things about what can be done about these issues, since you guys are on the ground. I think that's really important. You want to make
Just a
a quick comment?
I mentioned this to you earlier. I'm new to Christianity, meaning that I'm only been a Christian 12 years of my 46 years life.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, I see a rush of people running away from what they call fundamentalism. And basically, they're washing their hand of their own faith and in the process of becoming what the new world is offering them, and they call it the right thing. To me, that's actually totally wrong. To me, Bible speaks for itself. You don't need to get rid of it.
I hear what you're saying, and I do think that we will regain some sense of what morality is after everything's been unwound. And the comforting thing for me about that is God is God, and God is still God, and God will be God in this. So I don't think we have to have a lot of anxiety about what fundamentalism, or on the other hand, what other constituencies of Christianity would do to the world
Because
of
like
practice.
every decade that we go forward, and there are the society is obviously moving forward, evolving, and as the church, we have to also see what are the current needs of the community and see how we can respond to those needs. But at the same time, I don't think we should lose our identity so we could be part of the community. I think sometimes the risk is that literally we are losing our own identity just to be part of the crowd.
If we could lose some of our identity to really serve that part of the community, I'd be okay with it. But I think where we're losing our identity these days is to just try to get some of that community to come and populate our church. So it depends on how authentically we're really engaging in mission or discipleship, in my mind. What can be done about these issues that we're all facing? I think bigger shops like St. Paul's in your diocese, something to be said, if there's still lots of young people in the church, they're just maybe not in your church. They're probably going to bigger Episcopal congregations. And they're probably going there because there's enough of a constituency of people to find a foothold there. And that's fine. That's absolutely fine. Bigger shops can focus on this. They can adapt excellence, and they can aggregate that diminishing share of young people. I think that's a reasonable logistical strategy that congregations can engage. I think the diocese can engage in creating regional sort of parachurch ministries that can aggregate, support young people from time to time in an authentic way. That will, of course, require significant resources, leadership resources and financial resources. And then I think more entrepreneurial leadership in the church can start communities that are different. Communities that look like the community that I've started, or look wildly different, so that the denomination can continue to really engage the culture at hand in an authentic way. I don't, when I was in discernment about whether to start paths, I went back and forth with the bishop all the time. We were in constant contact, and we were like, well, why don't you go here and try to do this? And why don't you go there and try to do this? And I was like, I thought about that for 5 years. And the problem with that is just like a slave can't serve two masters. If our mission truly is to aggregate people who are legitimately unchurched, we cannot have a church building. You cannot have to engage family systems that have developed over a traditional church over a period of time. It just can't be done. So you're going to have to start new communities that are creative, that break the rules, but still engage the principles of the gospel. Does that make sense? Some of you will have to go out and start those communities, and it will be hard for you to leave what you know and love behind.
Say more about narrative and ritual in the sense in which you mean that. I mean, I know what I think you mean by that, but it seems really key.
Yeah. So at FADS, where I serve, we don't use the lectionary. We study books of the Bible at a time. So when we started out, we did 1 Corinthians. We did 62 weeks in 1 Corinthians. I learned more about the Bible as a whole in studying 1 Corinthians for 62 weeks within the context of a community than I learned in graduate school, or that I learned in the previous, nearly 5 years of ordained ministry preaching the lectionary. So we're really quick to point our fingers at those fundamentalists. So like those proof texters, they grab those little things. The lectionary, with all due respect, is a massive proof text. It's just like a macro proof text. And what the great thing that we have done is like when you engage books in the Bible as a whole, within the context of your whole community, on Sunday morning, you're forced to deal together with the uncomfortable parts of Scripture together. And so you get to this point, you're like, wow, that's really powerful. You feel convicted by this piece of Scripture. Or you get to points where you're like, wow, this is really powerful and really strong, and we're leaving that behind. We do believe in female leadership in the church. We do accept divorce as an okay practice within the context of lifelong Christian community. So I think, and people don't, I occupy a space that is already engaged in narrative because we sit alongside the entertainment industry culturally. So people are hungry for story, but people at Fads know the Bible like exponentially better than any other Episcopal church that I've served. I mean, it's really remarkable. And some of those people would say, like, I'm a Jesus follower, but not a Christian. Or, so there's this tension there that's alive, but good.
And can I just say one more thing?
Yeah.
You're incredibly disarming. You are authentic, transparent. I think you probably could sell a refrigerator to an Eskimo. But, you're not a salesman, and I just, as a clergy person, I think that's just huge in the culture we live in today, just engendering trust. And it does, as you say, come out of serving the gospel, not church growth, per se. I serve a community that, split over a couple different issues. Old people stayed.
Yeah.
And these older people are like, they're going there. We're probably not ready for what you're describing, but it's like really cool.
Yeah.
It's really cool.
I think the culture demands authenticity now. The whole like wolf in sheep's clothing, like marble under the walnut shell Christianity thing just does not work anymore.
Yeah.
So, if it ever works.
You mentioned earlier about the attraction that the millennials have for mystery.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you balance that element? Would they be attracted to smells and bells and incense and orthodoxy that offers more of that whole mysterious ritual? And how do you balance that?
Some of them would, some of them would, and some of them wouldn't. And I think that's what we have to get our minds around. That's one of our leading advantages as a denomination, is that we have this massive tent, everything from really evangelical Protestantism to really Anglo-Catholic practice. And the issue is just, can you create that niche? If you look, I think a great example is St. Gregory of Nyssa in San Francisco, or you can go to St. Thomas in Hollywood that has, these are two like really thriving conversations that have very old style, deeply symbolic ritual and lots of like congregational singing and stuff, but they're really alive places doing really great ministry.
As a millennial, I can help you with that too. And that conversation is absolutely contextual.
Yeah.
Within your community, you have to ask the millennials what they enjoy. I, for instance, am a smells and bells millennial. you telling me you don't like the organ, I can see you are not a Smells and Bells. That's okay. But again, it boils down to the millennials within your community and your congregation. I, for one, really enjoy the organ. That's something that I'm almost not willing to give up, just because it is so important to me as a Christian, as my connection to my faith. And so you really do need to delve into your own community and into that particular context.
And the adaptation that's required, I can see that your name is Will, is that what you might have to give up, what you might be forced to give up, is the organ actually being played. Because it's $1 million instrument in a lot of places. And it requires like a really eccentrically trained, full-time or nearly full-time professional. So but hey, you've got in your pocket, I guarantee you, like hours of organ music if you want, So there's that.
That's true, yeah. I mean, but it's just as an example. It's something that I find important, but it's not.
On that same topic, I think there's this danger that we act like everyone who's between the age of 26 and 40 likes all the same things.
They don't,
And
right,
of course
absolutely.
they don't. And, I've been to a church in Tempe, Arizona that is oriented toward the ASU community, and it's this vibrant, great congregation, and they do all of these things that you'd say, oh, young people don't like those things. And it's a whole room full of them.
I want to make a comment to that, and I think it's really important because I want to separate it out. So I do think having a broad sense of the different choices that people can make is really, really important. But I would say, if over the last 7.5 years, if any constituency of people have been like really anti the work that I've been doing, if there is one constituency of people, it is young Episcopalians. And I can tell you why. And most often it's young Episcopalians who are in seminary. Because they're really bought into a model that really works for them. So if I don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying all the old stuff that we do won't work for any young people, because it will work for some young people. What I'm saying is the aggregate portion of those young people that it will work for is diminishing. It's diminishing very quickly. So that's why I say, like, big places, go for it. Just like go for the old school stuff, aggregate it, make it really good, go for excellence, don't go for weak stuff, because we sniff that lame stuff out pretty quickly. But each demographic has a constituency of people in it called assimilators that represent the demographic before it, and that's what we're facing here. So my older brother, who's orthopedic surgeon and 2 years older than me, is basically a baby boomer. He's not age-wise a baby boomer, but he lives in the suburbs behind a gate. He plays golf. He eats steaks. And I grew up in the same household, but I'm not. He's in that assimilator category. A lot of our church people are assimilators. So a lot of the millennials that you're getting in the belly of the church resemble more Generation X than they do the millennials. They'll still have some crossover, but I think that's important.
We sit in the center of the UCSD community, and I think one of our biggest challenges is we are surrounded by young, there's no question about it, but it's getting them into the church to begin to create that critical mass.
Yeah.
Because if they walk through the door and it's a very gray-headed congregation, they begin asking, where's a group for me? And that's our biggest challenge.
Good question.
Is getting them to the door, to walk through the door to really learn.
Let me give you just...
What you said, though, not to get people to come to our door.
I mean,
Yes.
isn't that the whole point?
Isn't that the whole point of
It's
the
that-
gospel,
that's the
though?
whole
I mean,
point.
like, go ye into
We're
all the
not
world.
going up here to St. Bart's, I mean, I think that's what it's been saying all morning. The point is to go out. That's what I think.
Well,
Am I missing something?
You're not missing anything.
I mean, we have a very small ministry called Theology on Tap, where our youth minister goes out to a local pub and meets with these folks, and they have a couple of beers, and they've been working through the screw tape letters for, I don't know, 6 months now, right? They talk, and interestingly, so they have this core group that meets every week. Interestingly, the waitress that has been serving them saw what they were talking about, and it says it's very, we're in the trenches, and she sat down and said, can I take a few minutes at my break and talk with you folks, I'm reading this as well. So I mean, that's, I think, what we're talking about more than, please come worship at St. Bart's and we'll try to have an alternative service.
no, I don't want to get into an argument. I'm not implying that at all. I'm saying, how do we reach out to all the young people in our area?
If you want to give it a shot, service. Service.
Right.
And oftentimes, your shortest route from, your church to the border might be through Haiti or something else like that. But if you want a strategy to walk away with, service. That's occupying a lot of attention of this constituency of people. It's building, it's building huge industry and social entrepreneurship. I mean, I'm wearing Tom's shoes, as a perfect example of service meets capitalism meets that hunger of a generation to make a difference, But we're not innovating in ways like that in the church.
Maybe we have about 5 minutes.
About 5 minutes, yeah.
And just one thing I want to address on the issue of mystery, in the Abrahamic faith, which has 3 religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, Judaism has formal mysticism, Kabbalah. Islam has Sufism, formal mysticism. And it's not one of the, we go to the mosque every Friday night and still be part of Sufism. In Christianity, we have mysticism, but my humble opinion, it's not as formalized as we have in the other 2 faiths. And I think that that's a challenge that we face in the Christian churches.
Not an Episcopal church, but it is.
It is another
It is a Catholic.
Absolutely, yes.
And so we share that heritage. You can still tap into that, but it takes a little shift to know your perspective.
Hi.
Go ahead.
I had something to say about the mysticism also, about when I go to church, I turn off my brain, and it's all of the other side of my brain. It's the non-logic part, and I'm kind of usually messed by the time church is over. But the most powerful mystical experience I think I've had was a Eucharist experience where the people in the room fed each other the Eucharist. And I think that what stands, even though it works for me at my age and being a cradle Episcopalian, but what stands between the mystery and the experience of it is an authority structure. And I wonder about future ways of sharing our faith, our balance between story and mystery, narrative and ritual, in a way that eliminates the archaic and culturally misfit authority structure without losing the support of the Episcopal structure.
Well, I mean, that's a pretty complicated, it's complicated, it's not. It's one of those things where it's simple, but it ain't easy. That happens by breaking the rules. And that's how the church changes in that way. We do have to bump up against the authority structure there. And that authority structure is probably going to come back and bite us a little bit unless we make a compelling argument for it not biting us.
It's really important to me, I'm just really, who we are is what we're gonna attract, okay? If you have the biggest building and the greatest organ and everything else, and we've got the message, it's who we are. If we're not welcoming and real, an example is I've experienced 3 different communities, big, small. Okay, All Saints at Vista epitomizes our church is not a building. When you come into this place, strangers are expected. But I've experienced going out, and I'm not saying anybody is any of those other things, but really look at your community and see if you are welcoming. See if a stranger
Get somebody else
comes
to
in.
look at it,
Okay.
because you can't really look at it. You can't see
It's
the forest
really,
through the
really
trees.
important. It's just, I think so.
I appreciate everybody that filled out that survey, so we have to do, just pass it to me.
Yeah, it is, because we gotta get ready for the next.
Great.
Thank you.